For the first time on record, not a single woman in her early 20s died of cervical cancer in England between 2020 and 2024. A disease that once took thousands of young lives every year, quietly, predictably, year after year, reduced, in one vaccinated generation, to almost nothing. This month, 6 more moments like it unfolded around the world. In an ocean, a laboratory, a flooded riverbank, a nesting box on the other side of the planet. Each one starting in crisis, each one ending somewhere nobody quite expected. This is where they happened. The vaccine. For decades, cervical cancer was one of the most predictable killers in medicine, caused almost entirely by a single virus, HPV, and almost entirely preventable, yet still claiming hundreds of thousands of lives every year worldwide, mostly among women who never had access to screening or protection in time. England began vaccinating girls against HPV back in 2008. At the time, it was simply a promising public health measure. Nobody could know exactly what 2 decades of that quiet, unglamorous program would look like once the first vaccinated generation reached adulthood. This year, researchers finally found out. Among women vaccinated as girls, the risk of dying from cervical cancer before age 30 has fallen to effectively 0. Doctors are now calling a future with almost no cervical cancer firmly in sight. Not a hope or a projection, but a measurable trajectory, built one vaccinated generation at a time. This was a story of prevention. The next one is a story of protection. The ocean across the South Pacific, more than a decade of advocacy from local island mayors had gone, year after year, largely unanswered. French Polynesia's waters remained open to industrial fishing fleets, its sharks and reef fish unprotected across most of its vast territory, while the deadline for global ocean protection targets kept creeping closer. On June 7th, that changed. The government announced a 520,000 square kilometer expansion of protected waters near its islands, bringing full protection across 1.4 million square kilometers of ocean, and finally meeting the global 30% conservation benchmark years ahead of many wealthier nations. The new zone shields 20 shark species, including the critically endangered scalloped hammerhead and oceanic whitetip, along with breeding grounds for 22 bird species and hundreds of marine species found nowhere else on Earth. From the scale of an ocean to something far smaller and just as fragile. The parakeet. New Zealand's orange-fronted parakeet is one of the rarest birds on Earth, its population so thin that every single successful breeding pair carries more weight than any pair of birds reasonably should have to. For years, conservationists had watched captive breeding programs produce modest, unremarkable results. A few chicks here and there, never enough to meaningfully shift the numbers. In 2024, staff at the Isaac Conservation and Wildlife Trust paired 2 birds named Nacho and Trixie, hoping, at best, for an ordinary season. Instead, the pair became what staff now simply call super breeders, producing 55 chicks across 2 years, 33 of them this year alone. 2 birds, out of an entire endangered species, are now personally responsible for more than 10% of its global population. On the other side of the world, another species was counting its recovery in decades, not seasons. The turtle. At Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge in Massachusetts, one endangered turtle changed the timeline of an entire 20-year recovery program. Blanding's turtles had been vanishing from the region for decades, their nests destroyed by development, their slow reproductive cycle no match for the speed of habitat loss around them. 20 years ago, Dr. Brian Windmiller began a quiet, unglamorous effort to save what remained, raising hatchlings by hand, one at a time, with no guarantee any of it would work. On June 25th, his team released 2 turtles that had never existed before in this program's history. Second-generation offspring, born to a turtle named Ivy, who was herself raised through the very same program, now welcoming her grandchildren into the wild she once couldn't survive in alone. And while nature found its own solutions, human science was fighting a battle of its own. The lab glioblastoma remains one of medicine's most stubborn opponents, protected by the blood-brain barrier, a biological wall that keeps most cancer treatments from ever reaching the tumor at all, no matter how effective they are everywhere else in the body. For years, this barrier has been the single biggest obstacle standing between researchers and a real treatment for this brain cancer. This month, researchers found a way through it. By coating therapeutic nanoparticles in sugar molecules the brain naturally lets pass without resistance, scientists engineered a treatment that slips past the barrier completely undetected, reaching the tumor directly. In mouse studies, it boosted survival against this brain cancer by 50%, not a cure and not the end of the story, but the first real crack in a wall that has held firm for decades. Sometimes, though, the best engineer isn't human at all. The river. In the waterways of London, engineers had spent years and considerable public budgets trying to solve the same recurring problem: flash floods, worsened by decades of hardened, straightened riverbanks, with nowhere for excess rainwater to go once the drains overflowed. Then a family of beavers moved into one London waterway and quietly began doing, for free, what those engineers had struggled for years to achieve with concrete and funding proposals. Their dams now slow the flow of water after heavy rainfall, reducing flood risk for nearby communities, while simultaneously improving water quality and creating new wetland habitat. Nature solving, almost incidentally, an engineering problem humans had been fighting for years. And finally, a shift so large it can be measured across an entire continent. The grid. For most of its modern history, Europe's electricity ran on coal and gas, its skies marked by exactly the kind of emissions the continent had spent decades publicly committing to reduce, with results that rarely matched the ambition of the promises. This June, that ambition finally caught up with reality. Solar power became the European Union's single largest source of electricity for an entire month, ahead of nuclear at 21%, gas at 15%, wind at 14%, and hydro at 12%, with coal supplying just 8% of the bloc's power. It is only the 3rd month in history that has happened, and the 2nd time this year alone. What once felt like a distant, aspirational target now looks increasingly like the new normal.